Thank you all for being here tonight for Basic Buddhist Teachings. This evening, I had a conversation with Sokuzan this afternoon, and have a rough idea of what I'd like to talk about tonight. And I'm hoping that there's some questions because it's an area in our practice that can be difficult, and that is the most traditional word for it would be sectarianism. But it's not just sectarianism in the form of ideology, but it's the replacement of our intelligence with concepts and ideologies. It's where we grasp onto forms and familiarity, and we use it to protect ourselves from reality instead of using the teachings to go into our world. This is not a new concept. This is something that has been talked about since the time of the Buddha and the Nikayas. I can't help but think back to, I spent 6 months or a year looking at the 5 houses of Zen. And the first house was the house of Chiezan. And Chiezan had the 10 admonitions for monks. And one of those admonitions was to be careful of sectarianism. And it's interesting because at that time, Zen really was just the students of Bodhidharma, the students of Huineng, and there wasn't sects of Zen. There was just this pointing, there was this insistence upon pointing at the truth. And yet, because one who realizes the truth is not separate from their own karma, has not abandoned causes and conditions, the way in which that manifests is so unique. So you have Chiezan, you have Linji, Zen Master Rinzai, you have the founder of our lineage, Dongshan Lianqi, Yunmen, Fayan. These are just names, but each one of them has a tremendously unique personality and style of teaching. Our lineage, Dongshan's style, was so intimate to me in that he wasn't an enormous personality like Rinzai was. Like Linji was yelling and shouting. Chiezan yelled and shouted. Yunmen was outrageous. Yunmen was vulgar and graphic. Dongshan Lianqi had these beautiful interactions. And yet, in all these various forms, they were pointing at the same thing. And so Chiezan is warning his students, don't get so caught up in the words that I'm saying that you miss the meaning. And if you take what I'm saying and you try to go to war with Linji, then you don't see what this is. If you take what I'm saying and you fight with Dongshan, you're not seeing what I'm pointing at. And it went on from there in the 19th century. So if we look at the Zen lineage, we have these 5 houses of Zen. But the Tibetans were looking at something similar. And 2 examples come to mind. One of them, Sokuzan talked about some years ago. There was a teacher named Ju Mipam. Ju Mipam was a very famous philosopher and Buddhist monk in the Nyingma tradition in the 19th century. And he had a teaching called the 4 Reliances. And Sokuzan has a few talks on the 4 Reliances. But one of Ju Mipam's 4 Reliances was rely on the meanings, not on the words. One of the other ones was rely on the Dharma, not the individual. And so similarly, trying to get to the heart of the matter, and it formalized in a stronger way even in the 19th century in Tibetan Buddhism in what we call the Rimé movement, often associated with Jamgon Kongtrul the Great, where he recognized this tremendous diversity and wealth of Tibetan lineage and teachings, and he devoted his life to preserving these teachings because he recognized that because of political situations, popularity, and favor, that these teachings could be lost. So he started this Rimé movement, this non-sectarian movement, of which Trungpa Rinpoche is a descendant of. Trungpa Rinpoche was the student of one of Jamgon Kongtrul's reincarnations. So we have strong ties back to this idea that if we get completely consumed with ideology, if we get consumed by dogma, we actually think we have something that we can fight with. We actually think that we possess something very profound and valuable that we need to inform others of. And so we ignore others, we cover them up because we are trying to force feed them an idea of how a perfect world should function. We don't actually relate to the situation, we don't relate to the individual. And Sokuzan and I, we talked about it in several different directions. Myself, Ondo, and one other, someone who's helping us with some fundraising. We had a chance to go to the Ann Arbor Zen Center today and just see an incredible and wonderful way in which the Dharma is being presented that's incredibly different from what we're doing. It's a very different approach. And it's easy to get caught up in, well, Sokuzan wouldn't say that. That's not how he teaches. And it's not. It's not how he teaches. And I'm here because I want to hear how Sokuzan teaches, and I'm not in Ann Arbor because that's not how I need to learn. But that does not in any way validate this or invalidate something else. On the micro level, on the most micro level, to look at that in the context of our Sangha, that all of us have some sort of inspiration around these teachings. There's some sort of connection and magnetism to Sokuzan and the way he presents the Dharma and how the Sangha practices and studies. And yet, even in this very concentrated form, the tremendous diversity in how we approach the Dharma and how we express the Dharma, how we express our confusion, how we express our clarity. And as aspiring bodhisattvas who, if we look at Ju Mipam and say, how do I rely on the meaning and not on the words? Well, we could practice that with one another to recognize that anytime we look at a situation, it's heavily, you could say, contaminated with projection. Not as a judgment, but just our spontaneous impulse to make sense of our world. We have to create labels, we create names, we create value and definition. And if we can just begin to get that into our purview, maybe we don't see the meaning in a sense that we can understand, but we can begin to see the suspiciousness of our thoughts about the world, our thoughts about what others are doing and how they should practice and relate to what is arising. And I come back to a talk I gave a few weeks ago about spiritual friendship. And I think that this is an important thing in considering what it is to have a spiritual friendship. Before we went to Ann Arbor, that was the word Sokuzan used. We just want to be friendly. We want to have friends. We don't want to do what they're doing. We don't want them to do what we're doing. We don't need to transplant anything, but we want to be friends. And in order for that to happen, there has to be a level of respect that says, however you need to practice, that's really none of my business. But I can be clear about how I need to practice. This is going to be a very long talk. Clock's not working, and it's only 6:54, and I've got to go till 7:45. Really trying. I tried to be funny in the Hojo today. I always experiment with that. It's a very dangerous experiment. It's a very dangerous experiment to try to be funny in the Hojo. And I think we startled some people out here. There was a little bit of yelling. But it was okay. I think the experiment went really well.
It was an experiment.
I didn't get kicked out of the Hojo, so it went well to me. The experiment was me seeing if I could see what it is for me to be funny. I'm still working with
hilarious. I think we both ended up laughing.
Yeah, we did. Yeah. So are there any questions about this? And I would just ask you to reflect on that. Reflect on how often we reiterate, we repeat what Sokuzan has to say, and how often are we doing that to look closer, and how often do we actually cover up? Sokuzan's example of depression. We call something depression, we don't look at it anymore. How often do we say, well, just receive, don't do anything unless you have to? And you actually, in a sense, you tarnish the teaching because you're just using it as a concept and you go no further. You just use it as an excuse not to look any deeper instead of saying, don't do anything unless you have to. What is that? What is it? What is it that I have to do? What does Sokuzan mean? To actually go and take the teachings to help us taste reality. So, any questions? Shoro.
Bowing. Could you say more about the way you're talking about sectarianism and in particular, at the beginning you said it sounded like you were setting up a contrast from like how I might traditionally think of sectarianism, and you were saying it's the way we use concepts. And
one way of talking about it is that when you take any form of position to oppose something else, when you take and lock down on an ideology in such a way where you actually try to force that, defend it, attack with it, that's what I'm talking about in sectarianism. With Buddhism, it can take the form of lineage sectarianism. It can be, I think that Zen is more valid than Kagyu, or I think that the Theravadins have a better understanding than the Chogye tradition. Or it can happen in a smaller form where teachers of the same lineage, you actually begin to fight over who's more correct. And it happens on the smallest level, as I was saying, where you and I might think that I understand, you don't. And if you could just see and understand the way I do, then there wouldn't be a problem. So there's no uniformity in that sense. And yet we have strong forms to help us begin to see that. So I think that's what I was trying to point out with sectarianism, is that defensiveness or the demand where we actually replace our intelligence with the teachings, that the teachings become stale or they become concretized. They don't have any fluid living quality to them anymore.
Sort of bowing. That reminds me, when Sokuzan recently was talking about, or maybe it was you, I don't remember, the gullibility.
Sokuzan brought that up, yes.
How can we try or practice that gullibility, and how is that different than like patronizing somebody?
Well, no one has to see that you're doing that. And one of the ways Sokuzan teaches is just simply, what is that? You think you really, really know, but you could still ask, what is that? What is that? Or when you clarify, when you ask questions to clarify what somebody is saying, you actually, in a sense, you go into their territory. What do you mean? How is that? Oh, that's interesting. What about that? So you actually engage them in a way where you become the student. You want to know. You want to know about what they have to say or what they're pointing at or what they're presenting. That's hard to do when our immediate impulse is to reject, or our immediate impulse is to accept, because accepting also does not have any real intelligence in it, because it just grasps it. It ceases investigation.
Does that stepping into someone else's territory, as we practice that or do it more, become more genuine?
I wouldn't look for any sort of result. It's, again, that's a form of sectarianism. You could say it's like, how do I become more genuine? You don't have to become more or less anything. All of these are pointing us back into our own intelligence, our own awareness of the situation. So we never have to look for results. Our intention is not related to results in the way we're used to. It's, as we're reminded continuously, it's just the intention. Any results that need to arise, you won't have any say-so over particularly. And any result that arises will become something else. So it's not really a result. So just returning to the intention. Thank you. Further questions?
Are you bowing?
Yes.
Are intentions results oriented? Bowing?
I think that inevitably we probably have those stories around that, but as we return to the intention over and over and over again, I think we begin to understand more what the intention is. In a sense, it's an offering. It's a form of generosity that we're returning to. So I think that on the path, or the way I understand Sokuzan to teach it, that no, that we're not looking for results, and yet we may find that we soften, we may find that we actually become a little bit more curious, we may just see more clearly the way in which we get locked down on our own thoughts the second we enter into a conversation. It seems that just returning to the awareness itself is what we're being encouraged to do. Yoka.
Yoka bowing. Does the intention protect us from sectarianism? Bowing.
To me, sectarianism, when I talk about that, is just a way to look at the positionality, to look at the aggression, to look at the warfare. And I don't think that the intention has anything to do with protection, because again, we're looking at a result. We're looking at some sort of payoff for what we're doing. And I feel that what's being pointed at is not going to just show up on a conceptual level. So the intention, you could say, is a gateway. It's a gateway into something that is without position, that's without any sort of substance that can be relied upon. So no, I don't think the intention functions as protection, and it is probably more likely to function as a threat, so long as we're still working with it in a relative way, because it's opening ourselves up to things that are contrary, ideas that are contrary, situations that are contrary to our paradigm, our standards, our norms for how the world should function. So I would say that the intention to be with all things, the intention to see the truth, could actually be more threatening than protecting.
Yoka bowing. Does the sectarianism obscure our intention? Bowing.
I don't know that it works in such a transactional way. The intention, as I understand it, is a lot more simple than we make it out to be, because it's just a matter of returning. So to just return to that original inspiration, to return to that intention, to return to the vow, return to the cushion. It's very simple. It's very direct. It's not overly elaborate concept. It's just what we do on a daily basis. It's what we do when we recite our vows. It's what we do when we take our seat on the cushion. It's what we do when we log on to Zoom and participate. We just continue to return. I come back to the idea of chanting the sutras, that was something that really doesn't begin to, it doesn't ever really make sense. But after doing it thousands and thousands of times, there's something about it that you begin to recognize as valuable. You're just returning to that, but it's not going to show up in a spectacular way, something that's like earth-shattering. So enjoy the simplicity if you can. That all you need to do is keep returning. Yun.
Yun bowing. What do you think might be the best way to approach your own sectarianism with the Sangha?
Book study is a really good one. Like, that's the perfect environment where all of our ideas are arising and showing up. We have an opportunity to exchange in that sense, and see if you can't ask some of those questions. When somebody says something that feels very contrary or antagonistic, see if you, instead of going and opposing them or shutting down and say, well, I'm not touching that, see if you can't ask questions to draw it out a little bit, because that could be really beneficial to everybody, including the person that's sharing. And I think similarly, when we ask questions of the teacher, it gives it a chance to see that as well. I feel that for a lot of people, not everybody, but book study is one of the most challenging forms. It seems that it can be quite antagonistic, because everyone's personalities have an opportunity to come out. And sometimes we just don't want to listen to people. There are people we love, like, oh, I can't wait to hear what this person has to say. And other people are like, oh, here we go again. So it's really good, rich ground to look at our projections. Ishin.
Bowing, you were talking about intention and returning, and you use, I think you said return to the original intention. Was it intention?
Yes.
What is that original intention, Bowing?
I don't know what it might be for you. I think for most of us, it's rooted in some form of understanding suffering, the first noble truth. I don't know a lot of people that continue to practice that aren't suffering in some way. Because it's hard to do. So wanting to understand that suffering and also coming to the bodhisattva path to try to understand that for the benefit of others. There's a lot of sincerity in our desire to live in a kind world or to be kind people. We just aren't always sure what that means. And so we return to that intention to train the mind, to be of benefit to others. So the way in which that shows up for each of us is going to be different. The way we might think about it is going to be different. That's how it shows up for me, is just returning to that intention to have some clarity around my difficulty.
Thank you.
Yoka.
Milka bowing. If something shows up as contrary or opposed to something else, is that necessarily sectarianism?
There can't be opposition unless you're holding on to a position. It requires two situations or two apparent situations for that to happen. So if you find something opposing you, there's some sort of positionality happening. There is valid positionality. There is valid not being okay, not functioning within somebody else's framework. But I would say that there's always some sort of grasping that seems to happen when we see it as opposition.
Milka bowing, how is that different than seeing something that's dualistic, like two opposing sides of something? Yeah, how is that? Is there a way that shows up that's not sectarianism?
I think we're getting a little bit further from what I had intended with the idea of sectarianism. It is my fault. So I'm not really clear about your question. What are you asking about dualism? What do you mean?
Milka bowing, I guess I'm just trying to, I can see like big picture sectarianism when you're talking about different schools and such, but it seemed like you were trying to get at something more subtle. So
Okay.
what are some examples of like more subtle personal sectarianism that
Sure. When you think somebody is practicing incorrectly, when you think somebody shares something in book study that's a misunderstanding. Anytime that you take your standards and evaluate how others are functioning within their context is an aspect of that.
Benjamin Bowling. My question is, how do we negotiate whether or not, how do we negotiate with people when their views or standards oppose ours, and we believe they're arguing in bad faith with us when we ask them, when we bring curiosity and say, why is this happening?
That's a really good question. I really appreciate you asking that. And I don't know that I could give you a solid answer to it, because the situation is such that if somebody is just not wanting to communicate, there's not much you can do about it. It's not something that we have this insight and we can seduce people into engaging with us around. So there may be times where it's just, there's not anything you can do. You could also see that your curiosity doesn't need to have the result of resolution, that you actually could, in a relative sense, benefit from just asking and getting to know, and their mind never changes and you never agree with them, but you looked at it there was a little bit of curiosity. So it's not resolving anything in the immediate situation, but it's a way for us to, you could say, stretch our awareness, stretch ourselves out a little bit into areas that we might not traditionally go into. There's a lot of opportunity to do that these days, it seems. When we do monk training day, once a month, Sokuzan has all the senior monks give talks. It used to be, 4 to 5 hour endeavor one Saturday, and everyone dreaded the last talk. Everyone was so tired, and sometimes feel like that about this talk. It's like Friday, and we've trudged through 5 days. We just have to get through this talk. But then we have to do it tomorrow too, so I don't know. Shodo
bowing. I'm thinking of like the 18 schools that showed up after the Buddha. Is there an intelligence to some kind of sectarianism?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Because there's not one single way to do this correctly. It's hard to see that. It's hard to see that because our training has to have a strong relative quality. We have to give the teacher the benefit of the doubt. We have to work with the concepts in a way that's concrete enough where we don't just fall into absolute relativism and say, well, everything's valid. We have to see what addresses directly for us. And so we have a teacher, we have forms. It's just seeing that that's not a universal situation, that some people really need to practice in different ways and hear the Dharma in different ways. In our Resent Center, I had an opportunity to meet a former bhikkhu who spent 19 years with Thich Nhat Hanh. He was full 250 precepts, Vinaya bhikkhu. And I would never want to do that. I don't think I could. It would not be something that I would fall into my own form of militarism because I'd be really good at it. I could do that. I can just do what you say. But to think that there's something incorrect or that he wasn't training his mind because of doing that is the misunderstanding, to think, oh, well, that's a lesser teaching, not having any idea his causes and conditions or what his personal relationship to, he had a personal relationship with Thich Nhat Hanh. And so I really enjoyed that conversation. I asked a ton of questions and I learned a lot about what his experience was like with monasticism at Plum Village and Deer Park Monastery. But I'm not ready to pack my bags. And I wouldn't invite him here unless I saw some sort of opening where that might be helpful, and that didn't show up. Bune.
Bune bowing, you are talking about clinging onto a teaching and covering up our intelligence. What intelligence are you talking about? How would you describe that?
Yeah, it's not a conceptual intelligence. It's obscured as soon as we take an object. And again, I think the closest we come to it relatively is that not knowing, that insecurity of the thread of the path. So it's a type of intelligence that is not defined by knowledge. It's I don't know if you would call it a deeper intelligence or a non-conceptual intelligence, but anytime we take an object and we grasp onto it, it seems like it's obscured because we can only see what we're grasping onto. It really limits our perception. When we don't take an object, then it seems like everything's a possibility. Everything's available. So I really resonate with that idea of not knowing, as it was said to Dongshan Lianji, not knowing is most intimate. That really struck me because it feels contrary, because it's so threatening, it's so frightening that we will do anything to cover up that not knowing. We don't want to be children. Only children don't know, and we don't see the richness of how much is available when we're not bogged down with grasping and rejecting.
Beyond bowing, does that kind of intelligence have anything to gain or get, go anywhere?
I don't think so. I think that I know I've told this story before, and this was very early on. I was in Dokusan before we called it Dokusan. And I asked Sokuzan these two questions: who are you and what are you? And his responses were not separate, just functioning. And just functioning is not dependent on the result. It has no demand for content. It's just functioning, and it will relate to whatever content arises. So similarly, I feel that the type of intelligence being pointed at is not defined or confined by content, and yet it's not at the exception of content. It doesn't exclude. It can work with whatever is arising, but it is very permeable. Things can pass through very easily. Sanho.
Sanho Bowing. What is a former bhikkhu or former monk?
So a bhikkhu bhikkhus exist. I didn't know this for a long time, but both in the Theravada and Mahayana traditions, and they observe the original 250 precepts that the Buddha set forward. And then there's something called the Vinaya, which is the monastic code that really dictates almost every aspect of a monk's life. And so you would go through bhikkhu ordination, receiving these vows, and your life would really be defined by the rules and precepts as they were laid out by the Buddha. And when if you're not going to observe those rules, you would return your robes. Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche went through this type of training and returned his robes. Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, who I've brought up before, was actually told by his teacher he couldn't receive these vows and he had to be a lay teacher. So it's just a way of training. And in Thich Nhat Hanh's lineage, they've observed those. In traditional Chinese Zen, they would observe those. Ordination in Tibetan Buddhism, they probably have variations, but they would observe those vows in the Vinaya. I don't want to get too far into this, but that was also the case in Japan for a long time, until about the 19th century, when there was a strong wave of persecution of Buddhism in the Meiji era. And in order to try to regain favor, Buddhism tried to restructure itself to look more like lay practice. And so that's when they started allowing monks to marry and softening those rules to try to, again, regain favor with the government. So it's interesting how those things evolve politically. Michelle.
Michelle Ryan. I have a question, but I don't know if it might take me a little bit. When you were talking about, so I notice we hear a lot of the same or similar phrases, like from Sokuzan. So there's a lot of repetitiveness.
Yes.
I find myself almost wanting to reiterate those same things, the same things that he says, the Sokuzan isms, or maybe something that you say. And it seems like I don't know whether I'm taking that as mine and not, in a sense, I guess, thinking for myself, or am I taking that as the teaching in the way it is? Because I've heard it so much, and it seems like that's the only way I can talk about it, is to basically mimic. How do I work with that? Or how would I know that I'm either doing that or not doing that?
It sounds like you're working with it. There's nothing wrong with what I'm hearing you say. I think sometimes if you feel inspired to slow down sometimes and actually reflect on something you've said that you've heard Sokuzan say. It's just like when he's talking about reciting mantras or refuge, that sometimes you get so accustomed to saying it, it just pours out of you. And then occasionally you could stop and slow down and contemplate. The four reminders is a good one. The first, contemplate the preciousness of being free and well favored, difficult to gain, easy to lose. Now I must do something meaningful. You might be able to recite those four in a matter of seconds. But sometimes to just slow it down, just like what I had brought up with Shoho Mike some time ago, 10, 12 years ago, saying that maybe once a day you could try to be a little more intentional, where you actually know what your body is doing while you bow. You actually bow, or you actually consider what you're doing as you prostrate and you lift your hands. So it's not about locking right down and never doing it mindlessly, but the awareness to move in and out of that. And so sometimes you could just slow down and just consider, I just said something Sokuzan says, what does that mean? But I wouldn't go into correcting it. Sanho.
Sanho bowing. On the topic of former monkhood, if we in Soto Zen leave our vows, does anything change?
What do when you say leave our vows, are you meaning the departure from the classical 250 vows, the Vinaya and such?
Sanho bowing. I'm imagining that one of the monks here at Sokokoji puts their robes on the shelf and leaves, but I'm also imagining that inside of them, maybe nothing changes. And I'm just wondering, is there a relationship between us claiming to give back our vows and the internal experience or something like that?
It's a fair question, and I would say that there probably is going to be some pretty sharp contrast, especially if we've not really seen what this is. We think that there is one situation, we're leaving for another situation. And I think that's why we're encouraged to try to see this through, to keep going. So I wouldn't get into some idealism of it not being different. I think maybe there's some more around that. I'm just not sure how to go into it unless you have another question about it.
Not right now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mozuku bowing.
Yes.
I think you're bringing up, or we're bringing up, the idea of sectarianism as we could bring the teachings into a situation and use them as a way to kind of ignore what's actually showing up. And I've been contemplating how I do that off the cushion, where a teaching will show up and I'll use it to justify something or to go to war with something. Is there a kind of sectarianism that shows up when there's an area of our life where we feel the teachings don't apply?
Yes. There is.
Mozuku bowing, how do we work with that?
Sometimes, maybe some of you know this. So the reason I teach on Friday nights, it's very simple. Sokuzan told me to. And I feel that if we could, there would be very little need for teaching if we would just practice. Some teaching is good, but sometimes the path is so hard, we need entertainment to keep us going. So we have these events several times a week, and they're very helpful. But what it comes back down to is that if you want to see how that works, you have to see it for yourself. There's no tricks. There's no replication of Dharma that you can create. And if you could hear just like one talk from Sokuzan and actually hear it, there probably wouldn't be much left to do. Or if you could read one sutra, there wouldn't be much left to do. So I know it doesn't always feel helpful, but that's the arena. That's where we need to return to over and over and over again. And we come out of that arena and we come to the teacher to clarify what we're seeing and what we're working with, but then we head right back into that 2 foot by 3 foot zabuton. And we continue to look for ourselves. It's hard, that kind of discrimination. We really think that there are areas where this doesn't apply. This is a spiritual path. It's not polarized with the mundane. The spiritual path is not something that has to leave or to separate. And so when we take a part of our life and we separate it, we cloister it off and say, no, this is an area I want to grasp onto, and I can demand, and there are standards, and I have to do this. That's like the area we're saying spirituality doesn't matter. Spirituality is not part of this. And so, yes, if you're looking at a part of your life and saying that we really just want to continue to be engaged and that's samsaric spinning, that's certainly something to look at, but it's not to go the other way and to force feed spirituality into that. It's just bringing the awareness, bringing the curiosity into those aspects where you struggle, whether it's work, relationships, family, that we can return to that intention no matter what aspect of life that is. At least that's how it shows up for me.
Mazuku bowing, I hadn't really noticed this until this talk, but I'm realizing I don't think about the Dharma at work.
That's
much
okay.
at all, or a lot less. But that's also my least favorite part of my job, my life, is my work. So
yeah, don't soften it up with the Dharma. Don't try to take away the sharp edges of your work by infusing the Dharma into it. You don't need to crank up that area. And I know I've heard you talk to Sokuzan about this, and we've talked about it a little bit. And I feel that you are doing everything that you can to receive that negativity, that discomfort. And so I wouldn't make any strong modifications.
thank you.
Thank you. One more question, Sanho.
Oh, Sanho bowing. Can you be too comfortable in a given situation or too casual?
Probably not while you're here. It's pretty difficult. And the area where if the casualness needs to be tightened up, I have personally had the experience where that has been tightened up for me through Sokuzan, through the Sangha. And so again, I hesitate to say that anything needs to be modified too heavily. The very fact that you're here, there's going to be enough difficulty around that. And if you're not having it now, just enjoy that it's not the case right now. And know that as you continue here, there will be times where this will be very trying. And those are the times if we can remind ourselves of our inspiration of, remember when I thought things were too comfortable and I tried to make it harder for myself? I wish I could go back to that. So yeah, if you're here, there's not much more to do except continue to relate to the situation as closely as you can. Yes.
Sanho bowing. Can we in our behavior be too comfortable or too casual with Sangha?
I think that sorts itself out in a lot of ways. That again, if you have specific situations, you can bring those to the teacher. But I also think we should enjoy one another. That it's nice to be around people that you enjoy being around. It doesn't mean you enjoy everybody, but yeah, I think I don't see anything to adjust. If it was too casual, we couldn't bring Rumi over. There's nothing formal about having Rumi at the temple. He's getting really good at bowing in and out of the hojo. That's something, and he does remind us when we don't say the 4 immeasurables before we eat at home. And he knows the first few words, and then he kind of makes mumble noises while we finish it. Yeah. It's like, may all be and prejudice. And he wraps it up with us.
So relatable.
Yeah. Thank you all. Stand and dedicate the merit.
May the merit of this penetrate into all places, so that we and every sentient being together can realize the Buddha's way. Jivo San Chi 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 So San Mo San Mo. The 10 directions, the 3 times, all Buddhas, all venerable ones, Bodhisattvas, Mahasattvas, the great Prajna Paramita. O Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of the 10 directions and the 3 times, please hear us. Please come down out of the light and protect Sokokoji Buddhist Temple Monastery, our Sangha, families, friends, and visitors. Heal everyone who is unhappy, sick, or suffering, and fill them with light.
We were wanting to touch that for 9 years. Oh, is that true? Oh my goodness.